But when we're talking about maps, we want to keep in mind, and this probably applies to all the other layers that we could look at, in this case, photography, stories, and so on, is one of the aspects of lived experience and the environments we lived in is power, right? And so whose map? Whose map gets to be used? Well, a lot of the maps typically that get used in health and in urban planning and this sort of thing, making decisions about where a stop sign should go or what have you, tend to be the official maps, right? So there are maps that the city puts together, and they're often done, very well. I mean, they have good technology to do that, and what they portray isn't necessarily incorrect, right? Probably largely correct, but it may only be one aspect of what's going on. So in a sense, the lived experience map isn't there, right? Or the map that might relate more to the experience of people living there may not be reflected in those official maps. So there's a difference, and we have to keep that in mind. And that has implications for what maps we use and how. Who controls the process? So who gets to map, right? Who doesn't? Who's invited to that process? Who isn't? And often in the production of official maps, or even maps that researchers do, the participants aren't actually involved much in that process, and that may leave something important out. From a community development point of view, it probably leaves something quite important out, right? Their perspective of their own situation. Whose voice counts, so who gets to interpret the map, right? Who doesn't, who has to, ineffectively is silenced because the system doesn't have a way for them to be heard. In a sense, whose reality gets expressed, and then in turn, who's empowered or disempowered by all of that. So, I mean, knowledge is power, right? And this is a fundamental instance of that. So as an example, here's an official map of, this is one view of a neighborhood with looking at police calls. I forget which state this is in the U.S. Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, I think. And so this is the kind of map that the police department in a county or a city might produce. In this case, it's in the U.S. And it's looking at the number of police calls. I guess, in a sense, we're looking at hotspots, what the cops would call hotspots, right? So more stuff, more bad things happen in some places than others, right? And that's useful, right? Obviously, you want to know that. But it's the police department's experience of the neighborhood, and essentially probably shapes how they think about the neighborhood, right? And it's a place where that's a corner where we got to watch that one, right? That's a problem area. So it's one view. Another view might be something like this, which it doesn't look nearly as slick, but it's actually, in a sense, a lot more fun. This is zeroing in on one of those intersections. And what it's telling us is, so what's it like to live in that official map? Well, inside that is the lived experience of some kids that live in that neighborhood, and they have to navigate. And navigation, by the way, is a really important metaphor in this stuff that we found. Navigation kind of is the interface between the lived environment out there and people's actions, right? It's us moving through and adapting, in this case, finding a way to survive and navigate in our environment, right? In this case, it's kids doing that. Those black lines are shortcuts that kids take to avoid the drug dealers on the corner. Okay? So when you ask kids, where do you go? How do you live in that space? What do you do? One of the things they might tell us is something like that. Now, they might also tell us, this is the route I take to school, or this is the route I go to the playground, and I don't go that way because it's kind of scary or whatever. But I mean, this is a bit of a dramatic example, but I mean, it shows you that it's a different layer of information that's related to what the police information was giving us, but it's from a very different perspective. So, now, by the way, you could mess this up. If we decided that, for some planning reason, for example, we might block off some of those shortcuts. Or you didn't allow somehow, or you made it difficult, maybe even unintentionally, for those kids to take those shortcuts, and where it may became perhaps more necessary for them to go through that intersection, that would be a problem, right? So there are implications to how that environment is managed. Or if they have to go really far out of their way to find a shortcut around, that has implications. On top of, now we get into the layers, so the idea that if we have a map, well, we could have photos, right? So and that photo can be geolocated. You know, we can do it in sophisticated ways like geocoding it, and we can do it, Suzanne will probably give you some examples of this. We can locate that on a Google map and actually digitally put a photo there, and you could pull it up on a website and look at it. And we could add them and remove them and so on. Or we could roll one out of the table or put it up on the wall. You know, we'll do a hand-drawn one, and you can come up and put yellow stickies on there, or pin a photo to it, right? And then we could go up and look at it, or a bunch of kids in the room could do that. So you can, I think it's intuitive that you could link a photo to a given point, right? And so now what we're getting as people are moving through or doing things in their space, kind of what they're seeing, and what they're seeing isn't not so much simply objectively, but what pictures do they choose to take, you know, and why is that meaningful for them, right? And of course, to do that, we'll probably have to ask them some questions and get them to talk about it. But even just the act of taking photos is that there's a little bit of skill transfer even involved in this. On one hand, you might say, well, just pick up a camera and take it, but in order to take a picture, in order to take a considered picture, you might want them to say, well, if you want to think about what picture to take, think of a box, think of a frame, and go around like this and try to get a sense of, okay, yeah, that's it, right? Just to kind of get your head into that, and that's been found to be useful in some cases here. But the idea of getting to think about, how am I going to communicate what I'm seeing here? I'm using kids, by the way, as an example a lot here, but this wouldn't necessarily have to be restricted to any particular age group. I mentioned that as soon as we're talking about space and time issues on the map and also the photos, we're probably going to have to ask them questions briefly to get a sense of, well, why do you go that way? Or what happens over here? Or what is it about this? What's going on in this picture? All right. I mean, we're going to have to talk to them at some point. In order to do that, we're going to elicit stories. We're going to get narratives, right? And that might be done one-on-one, or it might be done in a group. And there's implications both ways for doing that, and methodological considerations, and it depends what you're trying to ultimately get out of it. But it could be done either way, or it might be done both. I think that my colleagues have had experience doing both. Rich's work, by the way, I mentioned Rich Carpiano doing the walk-along interviews. That would fit right in. That's where this comes in. Because some of those interviews might take place as you're walking through the neighborhood, taking the photos as they're being taken, right? And then in a sense, the story is also being geocoded. It's being linked to the photo and, in turn, to the map. So there's the story actually gets located. That's where this happened, right? That's where this bad thing happened to my mom, right? Well, that's why I won the race, or that's where I go meet my friends to shoot the hoops, right? That sort of thing. That's where my grandma goes to the doctor, right? So all of those, so we start to see this kind of pulling together vertically of these different layers of information, and implicitly these different layers of lived experience.